And we are back. Thank you again for joining us on day 2 of the summit. I am very excited about this session because it's been over a year in the making. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we had our keynote speaker scheduled to speak at our summit in Washington, D.C. last March of 2020. And of course, the summit got canceled. DC shut down a week before the summit, and then everything just snowballed from there. And then when we hosted our virtual summit this past October, our schedules didn't align, so we just couldn't get him here. But today, finally, I'm excited to have our keynote speaker, and I'm going to introduce the person who's going to lead this conversation, and that is my esteemed colleague, John Simpson, who's Program Director of the Business and Entertainment Management Program at the Kogod School of Business at American University. John is not only the former exec director of Sound Exchange, but most importantly, he's also the former MIA president. I think 2 presidents ago. And that's very important. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say thank you.
Yeah, just a little tidbit. We have a plaque for our keynote that I'm just going to show on screen that we had prepared for our DC event. And despite it saying 2020, I think I'm still going to send it because I feel like 2020 was such a twilight zone for everyone anyway. So I'm just going to let you take it from here, John. Thank you so much.
No worries. For those of you who were with us at the last in-person DC summit, which was 2016, I believe, we had the great pleasure of having Mitch Glazier with us, who gave us a great briefing about what the major issues facing the Recording Industry Association of America and frankly the music industry at large. And they were just at the beginnings of getting the Music Modernization Act written and getting the coalition together and doing all that stuff. And there's been one slight change, I think, Mitch, for you in the interim period of time other than the pandemic, and that is that you're now the president and CEO of the Recording Industry Association. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I remember you started at the RIAA in February of 2000, right?
So, yes, I did, just as Napster was hitting all of our college campuses.
Exactly. So, speaking of which, you went to Vanderbilt for law school, so you were in Nashville, but was there an aha moment for you when all of a sudden you knew, I have to do intellectual property, I have to do, as a lawyer, I have to do music? Just let us know a little bit about that background. When did that happen?
Yeah.
Uh-oh, I think you're frozen. Sorry, everybody. Probably Mitch's Wi-Fi, but we'll hopefully get that fixed pretty quickly. I think you might have to sign in again. Is this like I have to do the stretching thing? I hope everybody's doing okay out there. If you're not listening to Phoebe Bridgers or Arlo Parks, you should be. 2 great new artists that have been taking up my playlist. Mitch mentioned Napster, and when we get back to it, he started at the RIAA, as I mentioned, in February of 2000. I started there in March of 2000, almost exactly a month after he did. And of course, I was hired by the RIAA to help launch what became Sound Exchange, which I was fortunate to have the pleasure to run for 10 years. But we were both in there at the, at the early days of Napster. And in fact, Mitch was there for legislative and government advocacy. And I was there, again, to launch a trade association. But having been one of the few people who had been in the day-to-day music industry working at the RIAA, they sent me out to actually debate Sean Parker of Napster fame, and then later Facebook and Snowball and so many other startups at Indiana University. We had an interesting debate about Napster and Indiana was being sued by Metallica at the time. Metallica sued 3 colleges and universities who were, providing bandwidth to all of their students who were basically taking for free copious amounts of music, a definite major shift in the way music was being consumed and distributed, much to the chagrin of record labels and most artists. A few artists were renegades out there at the time. Mitch is connecting. Hopefully we're back. All right, you're back. Oh, you're on mute though. I think you're muted. Yeah.
All right, we tried it from a different browser. So sorry about that.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I got to tell them about going out and debating Sean Parker at Indiana University when Hillary Rosen sent me out there.
That's fantastic. They actually sent me to Vanderbilt one time, and I had to go after Chuck D, which was no fun, let me tell you. I think I walked out with just like a garbage bag over me, just ready to take the incoming. Those were very different days. But I did. I was just about saying thank you for the plaque, and it's perfect that it says 2020. As my dropping off this Zoom indicated, it has been an unforgettable year.
Yeah.
And,
so I had asked you about that aha moment, but let's go back to that in a second, because you brought up the Chuck D debate, and there was this very hostile environment between the labels and the artists back in 2000, in the early days of your tenure at the RIAA. What have the labels been doing to try to combat that, to create better relationships?
Yeah. So
pandemic.
Yeah, it's amazing how much the industry has evolved. And this is an industry that's always adapted. I think people forget that, right? I mean, we started out with wax cylinders before we went to vinyl, before we went to cassettes and 8-tracks and CDs and downloads, and now streaming. So it's always been an industry that has adapted. And the same has happened for artists and their relationships with record companies. Today, an artist comes to a record company usually with a lot of data, some initial success. A lot of times they've gone DIY first. There are, in many ways, some lower risk factors. Advances are the highest they've ever been. Royalty rates are the highest they've ever been. The number of albums due is the lowest that it's ever been. Artists have more choices than ever. They can go to sound royalties and get an advance if they want. They can go buy digital music platform services on their own. They can form their own record label. They can create music using Pro Tools, and they can go to Jamcard and align themselves with a producer and a songwriter. So all of these sort of gatekeeping pieces that used to define sort of the record companies of 30 years ago or 20 years ago now has evolved into what I would say is a pretty competitive and sort of sophisticated environment of services, where major labels, if you sign with a major label today, it's because you want to, not because you have to. It's because you don't want to call the radio station in Indonesia and you don't want to put together, all of the distribution and promotion and marketing, pieces. And you want those relationships that people have with producers and songwriters, et cetera. And you want that upfront advance so you can quit your day job and focus just on music. And you've proven yourself in a lot of ways. So I would say that the relationship today is a sophisticated relationship where artists come to a record label with a little bit more experience a lot of times, and where contracts are very different than they used to be. You never heard of 30 years ago an artist keeping their own copyrights unless they were, so successful that they wanted to buy them back or something like that. And today at all levels, depending on what the artist wants and what the label wants, there's every variation. So I think the democratization of the music business has changed the business in a lot of ways, but what hasn't changed are those key services that labels offer to artists that they want and they need.
But you're seeing essentially a cooling off of some of that rhetoric between the artists and the labels.
Yeah, I think not not completely. I mean, that it will always exist at some level, because you've got, a label that is putting in the money with a giant, failure rate and a big risk proposition, where still those who are very successful have to fund the investment in those that aren't successful, and that's part of the business. So there'll always be some tension between sort of like the part of an artist's career when they're calling up the record company saying, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you promoting more? Why aren't you spending more money? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this? To the back end, which is, why'd you spend that much money? There's always going to be tension there, just because of the roles that each of them play. But I would describe it much more as a partnership today. Where labels, where artists go in eyes wide open, well represented, and there's sort of almost like a Chinese menu of services, where if you want, you can go a la carte, but many artists still want that sort of full service investment, because they want to be global superstars and they want that access to, dozens of major markets all around the world. So I think the rhetoric has cooled off. We're certainly not in the Napster days. And licensing by the record companies has become much more unique. I mean, they want competition in the digital marketplace. They're licensing everybody on a global basis. And the indies are as well. And so I'd also say that the relationship between the indies and the majors is probably better than it's ever been.
Would you credit that to organizations like Merlin and Win and A2IM, or is it just?
I think Merlin had a lot to do with it, because when the indies were able to get together and license collectively, they have the power of a major, and so and in fact they often go out and cut deals first, and so that sort of I think Merlin is bigger than Warner as a licensing entity. And so that does change the landscape. But also, I think that the policy issues aligned us. It was making sure that platforms treat creators fairly, making sure that, even a recent example in California, that, the labor laws didn't create, an employment relationship within everybody in the industry where it wasn't manageable or we couldn't survive. COVID did a lot to bring everybody together. The Music Modernization Act taught us that if we're going to make change, we have to do it together. We can't just each look out for our own piece. So I do think that there's an understanding today that this is a very interdependent ecosystem and that all parts of it have to be healthy. Live has to be healthy, composition has to be healthy, recording has to be healthy, because if one of them isn't and one of the revenue streams gets upset, it impacts the other.
I mean, having mentioned that, so let's unpack a little bit of that. So the pandemic obviously pretty much cratered live performance. So you have a lot of musicians who can't tour. What has the label's response been to try to respond to that or help?
Yeah, each label on an individual basis with their artists basically put together a care package, and then we, the broader music community, on a policy level, came together. I think in 48 hours, 60 organizations had a website, musiccovidrelief.com, that for unemployment insurance set up applications in all 50 states. Every member organization educated their folks on how to apply, and then we developed a lobbying task force, both at the federal level and at all of the state levels. And so working with the new National Independent Venues Association, which is another product of COVID and the live industry pressure, everybody lobbied for the $15 billion of money from Save Our Stages to help venues stay alive during the pandemic, at the same time that the unemployment insurance program was being extended to help the musicians stay alive during the pandemic. And it certainly wasn't easy. Even once the monies got appropriated, the states weren't set up to implement them correctly. So then we had to go into the states. So we sort of had it done on two levels, from record companies sending, recording equipment to their artists at home, and, taking care individually of advances or whatever needed to be done, combined with that larger macro piece, which was all of us getting together to sort of lobby for those policy issues and make changes. And now, as we're starting to reopen live, you can just sense the hunger, both from the creator side and the venue side and from the fans. I mean, it's I'd say maybe every 10 minutes, I get an email from another venue. We are opening on this date. Don't forget. And you can just sense the, elation of everybody to get back to live music.
So one of the things clearly that the lack of touring income shone a light on was streaming revenue. Where are the companies at this point, or where's the RIAA if you have a position on user-centric versus the traditional? Is there still more work that needs to be done in terms of figuring out if that's really helpful or?
Yeah, I think the answer is we don't know yet. The labels haven't stated a preference for sort of the pool model or the user-centric model. I think different artists on different labels would benefit from different models. And so, choosing between some artists receiving some portion of revenues versus other artists receiving other portions of revenue certainly isn't something that the labels would want to dictate. But I do think that, the data that will come out of SoundCloud switching to user-centric and Deezer switching to user-centric compared to the Spotify pool method will give everybody some real life examples of how particular artists are doing. And it could be that different artists do differently in different genres. And artists signed to indies might do a little bit differently than artists signed to majors. In the streaming world, it's so different than any other model before it, because it's not like there's a wholesale cost and the artist is getting an upfront piece, whether the audience listens or not. It's not about a purchase. It's about a listen. You only get paid if you get listened to. And so, major labels tend to sign artists that have more mass appeal, whereas others might sign more niche artists that have appeal to a particular audience. And so you can see how sort of pooling it and taking a percentage based on gross number of listens might be different for some people in some genres than getting 100% of all the people that just listen because you're only reaching that sort of particular audience. So it's a difficult question that I think we're going to have to rely on data to see. I don't know that it will affect the labels very much, but it does affect different artists who are positioned differently. So it's really important. And, artists who most artists depend on live performance anyway, which is why COVID has been so difficult, but especially artists in those genres where you appeal to particular audiences, that touring revenue is, hugely important. And I think that there is a debate about pooling versus user-centric, but I think that live coming back will be much more important than moving to one model or another.
Right. Yeah. Interestingly, Benny from ABBA, had an interesting proposal, and he was even digging down further or drilling down further, saying that we ought to have a different royalty rate for lean back versus lean forward listens on these services. The idea being, if you specifically pick something, then it should have a higher rate than if you're just listening to a playlist.
Yeah. And, in the US, when it comes to, lean back listening on a service that doesn't have an interactive piece, right? There is a separate rate that's done on percentage of revenue, for example, for satellite, or that's done on a per play basis for webcasts where it's lean back. And so I think that the licensing structure in the free market actually allows for all of these options, to tell you the truth. You have these services that have both interactive, on-demand, subscription-based picks by the audience, by the listener, but they also have a component that might be a radio component. And to me, and I'm sure all of the licensing entities are looking at it, the majors and Merlin, they can consider how to best license these different parts of the same service to maximize their revenues and the revenues of their artists.
Right. So is there any, I'm guessing we know the answer to this question, that the majors certainly favor the paid tiers to the ad subscription tiers. And we've had the issue with YouTube with the, the issues with YouTube licensing at much lower rates. Do you see any movement there, or is that pretty much something they've agreed to just live with?
I think that there is movement because all of the platforms are discovering on the audiovisual and the music side that content really is everything, right? And so if you're going to maximize revenues, it's pretty easy to see that you can get through subscription a lot more revenue with a lot fewer listeners than you can from an ad-based service where you might have a ton of listeners, but substantially less revenue. And so, some of the sort of public nature of these companies has helped because it turns out shareholders would like revenue. Sometimes the companies themselves realize that in order to have enough listeners to survive as a profitable service, you would have to scale so high that there's only room for one or two of them in the universe. And so subscription and then innovation within the subscription model becomes really necessary. And, within the subscription model, there's sort of hi-fi, high-end audiophile services where you can charge more. There can be niche services. There can be general services. I mean, I think we're just at the beginning of people sort of innovating in this space. But it's astounding when you look at the revenue models of how much, 83% of all revenue in the recorded music business in the US today comes from streaming. Wow. Of that, 63% is from subscription, right? So, and much fewer listeners, even though it's a lot of listeners compared to what you would get on an ad-based service. Even YouTube, which is obviously the most scaled and the biggest ad-based service, is really pushing its subscription service, especially outside the US, because that revenue coming in is absolutely necessary for new creation. So I do think that there is movement. I think the platform parity debate is on a low rage instead of maybe on fire these days, but it's still there. We still have a lot of platform parity issues. We still don't get paid for radio in the United States, which is ridiculous. We still have loopholes in the Digital Money and Copyright Act based on 1998 technology where, everybody thought that these platforms would be sort of passive services. And we called them bulletin boards at the time. They were like FTP sites. You and I are old enough to remember that, where the service really didn't have much involvement in the recommendation or the optimization of the content. They didn't even know what was being uploaded. They were really just a neutral platform. And that's why they got a safe harbor, because it was viewed that they shouldn't be held liable for other people doing things on their platform. But if you look at the platforms today that get the DMCA safe harbor, I mean, they know exactly what's being uploaded. They optimize the material. They push it to different subscribers or to different listeners. They're involved in, everything from the recommendation to the review. That's called a publisher. That's called a distributor, right? And so there is this sort of unfair competition element between an Apple and a YouTube, where from the fans' perspective, they might offer very similar types of services, on-demand music listening, whenever you want. But from the payment standpoint to the creator, they're very different. So while it is better, we still have holes, I would say, to fill in platform parity.
So you mentioned, the fact that we still don't get paid, recording artists don't get paid, and record labels don't get paid for terrestrial radio. And of course, that was originally, that the Fair Play was a part of the Music Modernization Act when it was first being considered, and got removed so you could get a bill passed, knowing that the broadcasters would, revolt and keep it from going forward. Do you see any chance in the near future of getting a terrestrial? Does some part of radio say, hey, we embrace it?
I do think that there are independent broadcasters who embrace it. I think that as time moves on, there will be a lot of smaller broadcasters who, will realize that once people start accessing FM programming on a mass level from their smartphones and not from their antennas in their cars. And as more and more cars have Wi-Fi in them, I hope people don't stop listening to FM programming, because I think there's an incredible place in our culture and in our, in our listening for FM programming. But how you access FM programming and getting paid based on how you access the same programming is kind of silly, right? So I think just as a matter of course, naturally, less people are going to use an FM antenna to get access, which means all the broadcasters are going to have to pay. We are going to get paid for FM programming as time moves on. And if you're a smaller broadcaster and you don't want to go through the Copyright Royalty Board rate proceeding right now, and you feel like you're going to be vulnerable based on your position, and that vulnerability could lead to you being bought by a much bigger broadcaster and not surviving in the new sort of you must pay world, I do think that there's an incentive for folks on both sides to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm a small broadcaster. I want a place in the future. I want to cut a deal with the people who are providing me all of the great music that I'm playing in order to have that place. Whether or not there's a sweet spot there, I don't know. I do know that on the creator side, everybody has basically said, we're not going to jeopardize our digital future for our terrestrial past. So if what you're saying is you want to discount on the future to give yourself a competitive advantage against everybody else, we're not going to do that again. So, we will make sure that small broadcasters, have the right place at the table. But when it comes to the iHearts of the world, who already have a national digital strategy and an international digital strategy, I don't think anybody's looking to give them a cut. They've already had a break for 100 years. I think they'll be okay paying the market rate going forward.
So you mentioned the MMA. So we got huge legislation passed in 2018. It's obviously some of it is just being implemented now or becoming operational now with the MLC. What are the legislative initiatives, or what are the legislative fixes that you're looking at right now on the recording side, on the copyright owner side? So
we're still now trying to move forward with that piece that we just talked about that got pulled out, the terrestrial performance right. And within the sort of Digital Millennium Copyright Act, I think that there's a re-energized focus on how to fix the loopholes. So we're looking very carefully at what's happening in Europe right now to see how the copyright directive there has been implemented. But in the US, one thing with the partnerships that have developed between the digital services and the creative side in recent years have been sort of good, trusted partnerships in how to implement the DMCA effectively for some, but then there are outliers, right? So, you get some services who give you access through their API to their universe so you can see what the infringements are. We can search for those infringements, and then we can, automatically notify them. It'll automatically get taken down, and it may repeat itself over and over again, but if it's done by robots, it can be done fairly quickly. And, they're pretty serious about trying to get licensed and maintain integrity in their service. Then there are other companies, not to mention names like Twitter, that absolutely are driven, by content, won't admit it, don't do any of the above. So there's a conflict there between these, especially social media, digital platforms. And the question is, how do you get them to the table to be partners in fixing it? And I think Congress is looking at that issue right now.
You mentioned the copyright directive implementation in the EU, and they were looking at something, I guess we would call it take down, stay down. Do you see that potential? I guess if it passes in Europe, if that becomes law in Europe, does that essentially create the same law in the US, or would we still have to do something?
That's a good question. There are certain markets where they've made a lot of progress with the platforms, and the platforms don't have boundaries and they have global access, obviously. And so they haven't wanted to geo-block or to make, sort of different solutions for different markets. So In the US, for example, we benefited from a lot of the progress that was made with search engines in the UK, because they decided that even though the market was a lot smaller under the law, they didn't want to have 2 different or 4 different or 28 different systems. It could be that it has a major effect inside the United States. It depends how it's transposed in the different countries. France just finished their transposition, did a very good job. Germany is in the middle of it right now. Germany's not doing a great job. The creators are up in arms. They're taking a pause because thankfully they're listening to the artists who are going to them saying this is going to be a disaster for German artists. And so hopefully it gets implemented in a way that works and it does have ripple effects. But I think in the US, we tend to look at things more in the sort of consensus stakeholder versus regulated marketplace first. And there are in the US lots of standard technical measures that have widespread adoption. So my guess is in the US that the policymakers look at it a little bit more as an outlier problem and how to sort of follow standards that the marketplace has already adopted versus a highly regulated approach. That's just been our history. I don't know what's wrong or right. We just want it to work.
Right. So, we talked a little about Napster before. You had Chuck D, I had Sean Parker. That was a huge threat to cratered the business for a number of years until streaming sort of brought us back. Do you see any similar kinds of threats or things that the labels are concerned that's at that level right now?
I don't know that it's at the level of sort of an existential threat to the industry that's going to cut our revenues in half. I mean, one thing that the RIAA does is gather data over years and years and years, which creates this really cool picture, that you can sort of play with on our website if you want to. But if you look at the revenue in, real dollars back 20 years ago versus now, we're still at half of where we were, adjusted for inflation 20 years ago. So I think now, instead of sort of looking at an existential threat that's going to cut the business in half, it's what are the threats that are going to stop us from getting back to the value that we're, where we should be. And so stream ripping is one of those. And that's, that's where these partnerships that are developing between creators and platforms are important, because this is a hacking into the back end of a distribution platform. And, basically taking our content from their platform by hacking their system. We need their cooperation to solve that problem. And so I think another, especially aggravated by COVID, are pre-release leaks. Artists today are recording remotely. A producer might be in one place, an artist might be in another place, musicians might be in another place. And they're transferring files back and forth using great new technology, but it makes their systems vulnerable. The amount of artists and managers and producers and labels who are getting hacked today is unbelievable. And they end up on these pre-release leak sites. And then we have to sort of go in, enforce all around the world to try to get them off before too much damage is done. But that doesn't just hurt the sort of opening release of the music. It also affects the integrity of the artist, or getting something out there that they're not ready to get out there. And so trying to figure out how to lock that down is also really, really difficult. So, we also have new sort of mobile apps coming up all the time that basically are competitors to paid subscription services that we constantly have to take down. And it can be really difficult when you're trying to chase after these folks in the Android marketplace, for example, where you can get them taken down quickly, but they just reappear constantly. So there are lots of constant threats that we're facing. But I would say that, thankfully, none of them pose the same crisis that, peer-to-peer did before, frankly, we had legal sort of bases to know that we could combat them. I mean, it took a Supreme Court case to basically affirm that what peer-to-peer was doing was illegal.
And I guess we were suing college students before that, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting story too. People always forget that obviously the number one choice was not to sue grannies and children and college students. But this was one of those things when you're making policy. In the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the idea was that you were supposed to be able to get what was called an information subpoena, and you could go to, Verizon or AT&T, and you could say, hey, there's this number affiliated with one of your customers, and they're stealing all of our stuff. Give me the name, and then I'm going to send them what we called a pre-litigation settlement letter. In other words, I don't want to sue you, but I will if I have to. So let's settle this. Stop stealing from us, pay us some damages, and we'll move on. And they refused to do it. And so the record companies were left with no other choice but to sue the number. So they had no idea who they were suing. And then, of course, the number turns out to be all sorts of folks who you wouldn't create as a poster child for litigation. But thankfully, those days are over. And I think that the really licensing has taken over in a way that has allowed a ton of flexibility so that any user of any licensed platform can do whatever they want, basically. And to us, that's where it should be. A user shouldn't go, when a user goes to a platform that's legitimate, they should trust that the platform's done all the hard stuff to take care of all of the licensing to make a good experience for them. It's really insane if you think about it, that you go to a music platform that's legitimate and then they say, oh, sorry, customer, you're liable. We're not liable. Of course, we're one of the biggest companies on the planet. And of course, we could go license all the music and pay for it so you can have a great experience. But we just put that on you because, well, we just want to make money. So I do think that things are changing for the better and that there's a realization by social media platforms and others that it is much better to be partners and innovate and license together because it leads to new ideas and new services, and all of them are licensed, and then fans like it more. It produces more revenue and it differentiates the market. When Amazon decided that it was going to try and own the living room, because Apple owned the smartphone and they came out with the Echo, that was an opportunity for people to say, you know what, I'll pay $4.99 in addition to my $9.99 because I want a music service on that Echo device in my living room as well as on my smartphone, for example. And so when you have partnerships like that, it helps to increase the market for everybody.
I have a Zune. I don't know if that helps me. No.
I remember the Zune. Do you remember the best thing about the Zune was you could touch them together and it would share the song?
I forgot about that.
It didn't work very well, but that was the idea.
Yeah. Armand sent me an interesting question. So let's see. We have an audience question. Today we have SoundScan to track the sale of recordings. What was in place prior to 1970? So I'm guessing this must have been based on your certifications, right? So I'm guessing that was shipments, right?
Yeah. So what happened for SoundScan, and I think SoundScan started in 1980?
1992, I want to say.
Oh, it started even later.
Yeah.
So before then, we would collect data on shipments from record companies, and the Gold and Platinum program in the physical world had always gone on shipments, and then you had to wait to get certified until the return period was over. So you would literally get the shipment numbers from the labels, and then you had to wait 30 days so that any unsold copies by the stores or any unwanted, stock by the stores could be returned. And then you would, subtract the returns and you would end up with your total. And today, of course, the Gold and Platinum program incorporates, streams and streamed albums plus physical, which it's interesting. Physical is still $1 billion business, but it's not CDs anymore. Yeah. So vinyl has really it has overtaken CDs in the physical part of the market. And the great thing about vinyl, besides the fact that it's fantastic and it's got incredible artwork and all those things that you and I loved when we went into record stores as a kid, which is actually where my love of music started. It was my neighborhood record store. On Tuesdays, I was at my record store. And so vinyl now has become so innovative that they have figured out how to reach sort of key audiences that want enough features on special editions of vinyl, for example, that, you know, it could be $30 for a special edition of a vinyl record today. So vinyl's a very cool comeback story.
Yeah, no, I have my Beetle Butcher cover that I peeled back in the day, but still love the vinyl. And I think I had mentioned to you that some of these reel-to-reel now audio file recordings are selling. You know, I saw one that went for $499. Audio,
it's amazing.
Analog to analog on reel-to-reel. I couldn't believe it, but
it just shows you that people, right? We're humans. We like to collect. So the new generation collects digital NFTs, which, you know, to me is sort of astounding and wonderful. And I don't really personally understand it at all, but it just shows you that, you know, there's innovation based on sort of that human connection to music in lots of different ways.
Right. Someone asked about distro company also dictating curation. Is it a conflict of interest? And then they also mentioned that there's some equity ownership by the major. Should there be regulations in place to moderate DSP curation practices? Interesting.
That is interesting. I mean, it's always existed, right, since radio started, where you had program directors who were curating and deciding what was going to get played on the radio, and then relationships built to try to get them to play your music on the radio, whether it's managers or promoters or record companies. And so, you know, it's moved over into playlisting. But the difference is that it's not really just the DSPs or the curators. There are so many independent influencers who have playlists that really make a difference, and getting on those playlists can be hugely important. So I think that the world of sort of playlisting and who's involved has expanded to a point that it has sort of diminished, so to speak, the power of just a DSP curator, for example. That doesn't mean that the Spotify Global 100 is not incredibly important. It is. It probably has more followers than many other playlists. But they also have a combination of sort of an algorithmic way of rising to the top of that. Now, you can question the algorithm, and that's probably a whole other subject. But it is very different, sort of, than the old style. You know, you only have a few outlets and there's curation on those outlets, et cetera. As far as sort of investment, I think that for the DSPs, the major labels started as investors in the DSPs when they came over to the US, basically because there's no way that the DSPs, when they were tiny, could ever license 40 million of the most valuable recordings ever made. There's no way they would have enough money to do that. And yet you couldn't launch a successful music service unless you licensed all of them. It's not like you can just license like 20,000 of them and have everything that consumers would want. So they invested in the companies and in their success, but then they divested, a few years afterwards. So I don't think that that's an issue anymore. There are lots of folks out there who are investors in lots of different music services and record companies. Everybody from Liberty to Tencent to, and then the record companies themselves have invested in lots of different pieces of different types of companies, like Roblox, for example. So it's fascinating to look at the marketplace, but the investment numbers and percentages are so low and so diverse. It's just a very different world than it used to be.
Right. So a couple of things before, and you mentioned something, and I do want to make sure everybody on this call is aware of it, because the RIAA has great data. Shout out to Josh Friedlander and some other folks on your staff who do great research. And you've made it available to MIA schools at a discount. And I just want to make sure people know that it's really terrific. That and some of the data that the IFPI comes out with as well about the amount that record labels invest in new development, artist development, and in advances and things of that nature. Really, really important stuff for us as academics to.
Yeah, and we depend on MIA and all of the schools and all of the teachers and professors to basically use the data to educate. And so whoever you are, if you need our data, get in touch with me, get in touch with Josh Friedlander. We will figure out a way to get it to you because, you know, especially when you look at trends and sort of the history of combined data, it really gives you a picture and sort of helps you figure out where things are going, and you can break it apart into different pieces. And then we've researched, you know, lots of different, you know, individual pieces of the market, from, you know, social media to what impact the music industry has on a state-by-state basis. So we have a new website, 50 States of Music, that's a project not just of the RIAA, but of about 14 different music organizations, each of which put their data together. So that if you are, you know, in New York, you can go to the New York page and it will say how many jobs are because of music, how many royalty recipients are in New York, how many songwriters are there, et cetera. And it really does give you a really sort of interesting notion about what a driver music is. If you look at all of the social media platforms, they're all driven by music, more than actors, more than athletes, you know, more than politicians. Artists drive eyeballs to social media. They could not be where they are without artists. And so that's why we're so serious about demanding that they actually invest in having artists going forward, because it just makes sense. It's so interdependent. And yet, strong intellectual property rights and, you know, strong protections against theft are still a little bit anathema to the culture. It's getting better, but it's still.
Yeah. Someone asked a question, and it kind of dovetails to when you and I first met. You were working for Howard Coble, who was a congressman from North Carolina, a Republican. And I guess he was chairing the House Judiciary Committee.
He's chairing the Intellectual Property
Subcommittee. And obviously we got through the Digital Performance Right and Sound Recordings Act of 1996. Thank you. The question you know, clearly copyright issues tend to be bipartisan, right? They're not partisan issues where it's, you know, you've got to, and I remember later with Sound Exchange where you said to me, you need to bring Earl Scruggs to meet Howard Coble because that's his, you know, all-time favorite musician. And we did. And so it's understanding those kinds of things. And I'm sure you're still doing that today, right?
Absolutely. You know,
what's the climate on the Hill?
It's bad. It's getting a little bit better. You know, as time goes on and members realize that they actually do need to work with each other. Unfortunately, they've taken away so many of the personal connections through things that you wouldn't think about. You know, when you get a Republican and a Democrat together and put them on an airplane to represent the United States as a united entity in another country, that's important. You know, when you work out policies, especially in foreign affairs or intellectual property and for global treaties, you know, things where we're supposed to come together as a nation, you have to provide those opportunities. And it is so polarized right now that it makes it really difficult for the members to work together. Copyright is still a very bipartisan issue. It's a little bit more geographical probably than partisan. But even things like, you know, the Dr. Seuss, you know, event where the estate of Dr. Seuss, you know, announced that they were not going to be releasing certain titles anymore that were related to the causes of social justice. You know, that became a political fight where Republicans and Democrats sort of let it seep into copyright and created copyright wars. And that's really unfortunate because especially music, but all forms of art are part of our national identity and our culture. It's actually what brings us together. And so if that can't bring us together, you know, if we can't get two members to sit down and listen to the same song when they were both teenagers and come together in a mental connection on that point, we've lost it all. So it's not, all is not lost yet, but we have a lot of work to do.
Interesting. Someone asked, as they coach their students on careers as artists, engineers, and producers, And I'm guessing the same advice you give to your son, who, shameless plug, is at Berkeley. What advice, what do you think the most important skills are getting started in the industry? What do you think, and anything they should avoid?
So I think whatever part of the industry you want to go into, I think everybody has to recognize that today, production and writing and performance can be pretty blurred. They're less discrete than they used to be. And so I would say, if you're a student especially, take production classes, take writing classes. Even if you're a performer, take more than you think. If you're a writing major, take production classes. And, it's hard to define today. Take the genre of hip hop, right? Where the performer comes into the studio and they kind of have an outline of what they want to say. And then there's the producer and how much is come up with in the room, and somebody else has sort of done the beat, or you might have licensed a beat from somebody, but then they're in the room and then they add something else. It's a nightmare for figuring out royalties and splits and things like that, obviously. But the line between the producer and the performer and the writer is very fluid today. And so I would say, don't limit your skill set, for one. The second is the revenue streams from each are very important. So, just being a performer is awesome. Being a performer and a writer is better.
Yeah, well, that is certainly true. And I can attest to that when I was managing artists, because when you got those mailbox checks, though, they were wonderful. So let's get back to that first question when you froze. Hopefully you won't freeze this time. But so what was the aha moment? You said, maybe you did say it was when you were in record stores, on Tuesdays looking at new music. But was there a moment, in law school when you said, I'm going to use this law degree to be in the entertainment industry?
No, in law school, I was very focused on international law. And now I ended up doing a lot of international law. But at the time, I really thought that I wanted to be a public international lawyer. I wanted to go negotiate treaties. And after my clerkship, I actually got a job in the office of the legal advisor. And this is a great Washington story. President Clinton had just been elected. I had just been hired. It was a civil service job. But for those of you who remember, he was a centrist Democrat who ran on reducing the size of the federal government by 10%. So the first thing he did when he took office was unhire everybody who had been hired in the past, who hadn't started yet. So I got this letter saying, you've been unhired. So I went to a law firm instead in Chicago, a great law firm that I loved, and I did commercial litigation. And I quickly realized that I was going to learn a lot and that commercial litigation was not for me. And I moved to Washington to work for the Judiciary Committee. And it was 1995, and the World Wide Web had just been invented. Is that the right word? Created. It came into being in 1995. And so by happenstance, I was like the young, quote unquote, young lawyer on the committee. And the chairman said, well, there's all this computer stuff. You do that. You're the young guy. So that was the start of the Digital Money and Copyright Act, because telecommunications companies didn't know what to do. Creators didn't know what to do. And there was this new access tool. And that really started my exposure to copyright and digital copyright. So I've always had a love for music, and I always wanted to do something in the music industry. I knew that I couldn't perform. I have no talent. So, I was able through that exposure to, get baptized by fire in all of these new issues in the music industry. And then Napster happened right as I left the committee. So I don't know, have a penchant for emergency room medicine or something, but literally I've been up to here in new changes to the industry ever since.
Well, Mitch, thank you so much for graciously sharing your time and your knowledge with us. It's always great when I get to see you, although better when it's in person.
Yes.
And we will hopefully be in person again soon. Thank you again for coming in. I know it's been a great experience for everybody on the call.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Mia, and all of your members. You're the folks who are training the next generation of artists who are going to change the country. So we actually owe you the most. So thank you.
Oh, that's sweet of you to say. All right.
Bye.
Thanks.